Nature Solutionaries is a podcast about conservationists who do amazing things for nature and bring inspiration into our lives. Hi, and welcome back to Season 2 of Nature Solutionaries. In this season, I present the work of grassroots activists who have improved the reproductive health of their communities, the health of local ecosystems, and also the economic situation of people by introducing sustainable livelihoods. Today, we have a great opportunity to learn more about global trends in family planning and funding of this extremely important area from one of the key players in the field, Nabeeha Kazi Hutchins. Nabeeha is the president and chief executive officer of PAI, a U.S. nonprofit organization which advances sexual and reproductive rights in 36 countries through cooperation with 120 local family planning organizations. She has more than 20 years of work experience in international development, HIV and AIDS prevention and care, and racial and economic inequities. Nabeeha, you were born in Pakistan, raised in Mexico, and now you live in the US. And on top of that, you have also worked on different community programs in more than 20 countries. Where did you find the happiest people?
Thank you so much, first of all, Veronica, for giving the space. You know, my grandfather has a saying, and his saying is never compare one country or one context to another, because if you do that, you will never find happiness. So, you know, my entire life, having lived abroad and traveled to so many countries around the world, I always absorb what is beautiful about people and communities in the context that I'm in. So that's a really hard question to answer. I can tell you that the spaces and communities where I have been the happiest are in spaces and communities where there is hope and where there's a recognition that people's lives matter, that the rights of people matter, and even despite challenges and obstacles, that people don't give up. You know, that sense of hope for humanity and the commitment to keep trying until we get it right are the spaces that I've always been the happiest in.
Yeah, so it's not so much about the geography, but more about the communities. And these communities can be found in every single country in the world, right? So basically, we can be happy anywhere.
That's what I believe, and I think so much of it is mindset and outlook. Is the core element, I think.
Yeah, I was reading that you have two kids. How old are they?
Yes, I have two children. Actually, my son is in the office today. My daughter is 13 and my son is 11. And he's running around visiting with the team, and they're spoiling him at the office today.
So you have teenagers. Is that hard?
I have a tween and a teenager. I think every phase in a child's development and in parenthood it's just different, right? So the challenges and opportunities that we face now were different when they were newborns. I think the part that's both exciting but also can be frustrating in a beautiful way is seeing these little people develop their personalities and their preferences and, you know, challenge even what you thought these children would become. So I think it's constant learning and growth. It is absolutely a beautiful experience, but it's also probably the toughest job that I've had is being a mother.
Yeah, for sure. And especially combining motherhood and career, that's also hard, isn't it?
It is. I think, you know, we often, and by we, I talk about whether it's people in the workforce or not in the workforce formally, but still working, this assumption that women can, should, must balance everything. Look the part, cook the meal, excel in your career, raise incredible children, do it all impeccably is a fallacy. And the biggest learning that I've had is to give myself grace and know that it's not all going to be perfect. It's not all going to be scheduled. You're going to get a lot of surprises. And the biggest thing is how agile and adaptive you can be in those times of a last minute, oh, now we have the third ear infection this week, so we're rushing off to the doctor, right? Those kind of surprises that life throws at you, you can't plan for it. So, my biggest adjustment has been there will be surprises. It's how you adjust to those surprises and know that's just life.
And it's never going to be perfect, and that's perfectly okay, right?
Exactly.
So I was reading that you've worked in top managerial positions for various nonprofits concerned with public health and reproductive autonomy and international development. And for the last 3 years, you've served as the president and CEO of PAI. Could you explain to the listeners what PAI does and what is its mission?
PAI was founded 58 years ago, and it was founded with the recognition that women should have the right to family planning and contraceptives. They should have the right to decide if and when to have children. And our founders felt very strongly that we need to ensure that we held our government accountable and that this became a policy priority and there was funding for it. So our mandate and our mission is to advocate to the U.S. government and advocate on the global stage, not just for access to family planning and contraceptives, but now we've evolved to be much more inclusive and look at comprehensive sexual reproductive health and rights. That remains on the top of the policy agenda, that it remains a priority for funding. This is a battle that we have day in and day out, year in year out, and our work is not complete on that end. But we also acknowledge that we're part of a larger global movement, and being part of that movement means that there are many of us who are advancing this agenda. We work with 77 community-based organizations in 31 countries. 45% are women-led, and through this work of working with the local organizations, and many of them are also leading coalitions, we together have an extended reach of 1,800 organizations across 60 countries. And we're all advocating for the same thing, which is every single person should have access to sexual reproductive health and that it is their human right to have that access.
What are the statistics of the unmet need for family planning and reproductive health?
There's an annual report that comes out from the UNFPA. This is a United Nations agency. It's called the State of World Population Report. And in the report for 2023, noted that 44% of women and girls who are part of the countries that reported into this report do not have the right to make their own informed decisions about their bodies when it comes to having sex, using contraceptives, seeking healthcare, etc. And in terms of unmet need, approximately 260 million women around the world have an unmet need for safe and reliable contraception.
Huge numbers, right?
These are huge numbers, and it not only plays into people's bodily autonomy and agency as individuals, but it has an enormous multiplier effect on health outcomes. So we know that when an unmet need around contraceptive is met, we see from a immediate health impact perspective, there's a reduction in maternal morbidity and mortality. We see a reduction in unsafe abortions. We see improvements in health, nutrition, and wellness. We see improvements in education outcomes and economic gains. So there are a lot of implications around unmet need. And I think fundamentally, it's do people have access to what they need to achieve their aspirations? And right now, the answer is no.
When there are so many benefits, why is the unmet needs still so huge? And why is, surprisingly, the actual number of women and girls who want to use contraception but can't growing? People think that percentage-wise it's going down, but the actual number of the millions of women is growing.
First and foremost, there are ebbs and flows in funding for family planning and contraceptives. And I suspect we will talk a little bit about that. There is also so much social cultural pressure and norms that remain. And I would say the third piece is I don't see the level of investment in driving demand and utilization and better informing and addressing some of the societal and social stigma associated with contraceptive access, but also reproductive health. And this last piece certainly is something that keeps me up at night, that also is something of concern to so many of our partners who are doing their advocacy. And here's why. We can advocate for funding for reproductive health, for contraceptives. We can do, as PAI does, its advocacy to donor countries to make sure you fund supplies and commodities. Partners can advocate to their own governments. But if people do not go to access contraceptives, or if they show up and, let's say, an unmarried young woman wants to have a contraceptive, but because there are societal norms, she may get questions around, well, where is your spouse? Or why do you need this? And so on and so forth, that then maybe gives her pause to go back to the health center to access those contraceptives. So it's not sufficient just to say we are spending on it. I think the big win in all of this is, are people able to access? Are they treated with respect and care when they do ask for a contraceptive? And are they able to utilize it on their terms, getting contraceptives they prefer and for the amount of time they want to use them?
And in which phase are we currently now? There are times when there is greater support, and then there are times when there is less support. So where are we now globally?
From a funding perspective, in particular, for the past decade, the U.S. investment in reproductive health has remained flat. And one would say it's actually probably decreased when you look at the total value for dollar given inflation and given unmet need. The amount has remained consistent, sure, but we're still actually meeting less need as a result, right? And currently, we have a very complex political environment, given we are looking at the budget for 2024. And this is right now being debated by members of Congress who are elected in the Senate, in the House, to really determine what the funding envelope is going to be. And right now, there's a huge influence by the Republican Party to actually cut the investment by the U.S. into reproductive health.
Oh, wow. Completely?
To cut it significantly, to not fund UNFPA. And UNFPA is one of the leading mechanisms for communities around the world to access commodities. So again, these are all debates that are happening. Some would say, well, is this really going to happen? These are all debates and discussions. But I think the fact that we keep having a conversation around, is funding contraceptives and reproductive health the right investment for the U.S., continues to cast doubt on something that we know is fundamental to the rights and the achievement of people. And these are the same conversations that have occurred in some countries around the world among major donors. But we also see some bright spots, right? So Canada, for example, is one really exciting, relatively new entrant making very big, bold commitments to reproductive health.
I've always been thinking very hard about how to make people care about women's rights in other countries, because for most of my friends in the Czech Republic, where I'm based, reproductive autonomy is not an issue. They all have access to birth control. They discuss it with their partner, if they want to have kids and how many. And in case they need to, they can go and have an abortion. So maybe they know that in some parts of the world, there are young girls who are forced into marriages and they have to bear children at a really young age. But because it happens so far away from their home, it's not an issue for them. And maybe they don't see why they should support women somewhere in South Sudan or Venezuela. So how do you explain to people that empowering every single woman in the world matters to all of us?
We're actually never going to have gender equality if we don't actually care about the well-being and the status of women around the world. We're not going to reach our collective economic potential. We will continue to leave open space for these norms that have been in place from the beginning of time that are very much based on a patriarchal and colonial viewpoint to dictate what we get or what we don't get, what we can think or what we shouldn't think, what we decide and what we're not allowed to decide upon. And I do believe in the power of sisterhood. And I think that speaks so much to me, and I suspect to so many others, knowing that we must stand together, that we are each other's keepers, but there's also the reality that our economic health and opportunity is going to be unleashed when our power and our power comes together and we can realize our rights together.
Representative Shakovsky summed it up beautifully when she said, "We're such a small world, and what happens anywhere happens everywhere." You interviewed her in June 2023 at the 1 year anniversary of the loss of federal abortion protections in the US. Can you explain to the listeners the consequences of the overturn of Roe versus Wade by Supreme Court on reproductive rights of women globally?
Roe was overturned after a 50-year constitutional protection in the U.S. We, of course, saw a lot of chaos and a lot of confusion and a lot of outrage. And PAI and many of our partners who also do work internationally were quite concerned about the global ramifications. And I've spoken quite a bit about this because the signal that the United States sends matters. And this signal was, we in the United States were not going to respect the agency and autonomy of people in this country as a constitutional right to make a decision on abortion, something that was taken away after 50 years. And it would now be up to states to decide what would be the right policies for their own residents in those states. The piece that I found very reassuring was the fact that more than 70% of Americans support the right to choose. And that's an important message because the decision was made by courts, but it was not a decision made by people. And when people had to make decisions in their states, the decision was overwhelmingly, yes, people in our country should have the right to an abortion. Now, what is the effect abroad? As I said, the signal of the United States is very important. And this decision has been used to reactivate and re-energize an opposition base that is anti-rights. Immediately after the decision came down that led to Roe being repealed, we saw anti-rights organizations going into countries in East and West Africa to have their own mobilization. We saw policy commitments that governments had made to expand abortion care and access start to either fall off the table entirely or retract those commitments to even have a conversation. So I think those are the big concerns, not only in the opposition reactivated, but also now governments saying, well, if the United States, which is a great liberal democracy, has decided to do this for its people, then why should we take some of these issues ourselves on? We see a huge amount of funding going into countries by anti-rights to place political leaders, to influence laws, to activate and engage local communities with misinformation. Quite frankly, it's not even misinformation, it's false information. These are fear tactics, these are manipulations, and I think it's preying on communities that have every right to make the decisions in a way that's informed properly and to make their own decisions. And it is very concerning. And the last thing I'll say on this, it extends beyond abortion. We're seeing now threats to contraceptives. We're seeing threats to comprehensive sexuality education. Shouldn't we have information about our bodies? Shouldn't young people have information about about their bodies? We're also seeing threats to the LGBTQIA plus community. And these bans and these restrictions, not only in the US, but also a resurgence of opposition efforts to either double down on LGBTQI rights in terms of criminalizing those, the LGBTQI community, or having more expansive, extensive policies that restrict those rights even further.
Yeah, it's just terrifying. And what I'm most scared of is that it has exactly these impacts. These people will not stop with banning abortion, but they want to ban contraception. And as you even mentioned, the sex education in schools. And it's just horrible. I mean, how far do they want to go? And what's the goal? Like to just chain women at home? Or, I mean, I don't get it, really. What's the point of this?
Yeah, I don't, it's baffling to me, quite frankly, that an anti-rights minority cares so much about our bodies and so much about what we get to do with our brain and our voice and our autonomy. And I think it is grounded in a religious ideology. I think it's also very much grounded in wanting to control and wanting to control others. And that is fundamentally what I think is the biggest threat, is this notion that it's a long game for the opposition, and it's a long game to say, we're going to hold you back and hold your rights back because it is not convenient. It doesn't match with my values. Not based on what you need as an individual. It doesn't match my values. And these are all systems of patriarchy that we are trying to break down. It is completely incompatible with progress and justice and equity, completely incompatible. And quite frankly, the people in the United States, they're not standing for it. Again, I said the majority in the United States believe in the people's right to choose. And I don't think that people around the world are going to stand for it either.
Yeah, totally. I just finished reading a wonderful book. It's called Vagina by Naomi Wolf. She talks about female sexuality and how it has always been oppressed, or at least for the past 5,000 years, and why it's being so controlled. Because when you let women explore their sexuality, they suddenly become more creative, more empowered. They become thinkers and leaders. And I guess that's what this opposition doesn't want. They don't want women to, awaken and just be an active part of the society. So it's all about control, and people should protest against this.
And the irony in all of this is when we recognize and appreciate the power of women, the ability of women to make excellent choices for themselves and their communities, people across the board are better off, across the board, from an education perspective, from an economic perspective, from a health perspective. Women being empowered and their ability to achieve their aspirations on their own terms is not only good for themselves and their families, it's good for the world. And that's the irony in this, is somehow this notion of, if we put down laws and prevent people from achieving their rights, we're going to have a better society. It's actually quite the opposite. The data shows that. People's life outcomes show that. And I think it's a losing game. It's a losing game for those who feel the anti-rights movement is going to win, because it's not.
Yeah, I hope not. And I'm also fighting with this podcast so that we win.
Yes.
So, do you have any advice to the people who are listening, whether they are girls, women, boys, or men, and who want to promote sexual and reproductive health and rights in these turbulent times where we see so much conservatism and pronatalist pressures?
Don't be afraid to use your voice and ask the questions. Pay attention deeply to the political landscape, to the donor landscape. And I believe that it's important that we continue to make the case and we elevate why family planning, why sexual reproductive health, why the preservation of rights is so important. But it can't just be 30 of us, right? We need everyday people, girls, boys, men, women, and other communities who are ready to have the conversation and ask the question. I think when that happens, then again, you're elevating what the majority of people around the world want. And if we don't speak up, we're letting a minority really shape and dictate what our future should be. Certainly it's about health. It's about rights. It's about making sure that people can do what they want to do. But this movement is about the recognition that we love each other And when you love each other, you want to make sure that every single person has the best that they can have for their life and for their families. And so we all need to lead with love.
It's just so beautiful and I love it. But what if the other people have the same argument? What if they believe that what they're doing is actually proving love? Like they believe that if you ban abortion, then you're not killing innocent babies. And that's actually, just love.
Yeah, that is a manipulation tactic, certainly by the opposition. But I also think that the anti-rights movement does not ground its arguments in science, and it does not ground its arguments in research. And that is a fundamental issue here when we are talking about the importance of access to contraceptives, when we talk about the importance of access to safe abortion and what the consequences are when you don't. That is based on health data, on science. For example, access to safe abortion would significantly reduce maternal deaths and maternal morbidities. Unsafe abortions are one of the leading contributors to maternal death. I think if we're going to live in a world where we underestimate and we want to put forward policies and laws that underestimate the intelligence, that underestimate the abilities of people to make the decisions for themselves and their lives, then we are not walking in a world with kindness. We are thinking that some are superior and therefore should be making the decision for the rest. And that is precisely the history of colonialism, that a small group of people decided what was better for others, and we have the world that we have today.
True. Absolutely. And the sad thing is that these people, like this opposition, doesn't realize that if you provide women with contraceptives, you will actually prevent abortions from happening. How are they going to prevent abortions if people have unprotected sex, And they also totally forget about the fact that even if they ban abortion, women will still go and have abortion, but to like these back alley abortionists, and they will have health complications. So it's just as you rightly said, they don't have the arguments grounded in data, and I guess it's a lot about emotions and just manipulating people.
Yeah, and I think it's forced pregnancy and forcing people who can become pregnant to be pregnant even if they don't want to. And in the same countries where, and even here in the US, where we see there are restrictions or bans on abortion, we also see in these same countries access to contraceptives, including here in the US, access to contraceptives not universal. And even if they're available, a lot of stigma and access issues to what is available on the shelves or should be available. And then you add in the fact that there are questions about comprehensive sexuality education. So you're not getting the knowledge from a young age. You're not getting the supplies to prevent you from getting pregnant. And if you do get pregnant, then you're forced to carry that pregnancy to term. You've had an unwanted pregnancy. I don't see how that is good for society.
And how that is love, right?
And how that is love.
Yeah.
Exactly.
All right. Nabeeha, thank you so much for this interview. It was really very interesting for me, and I'm keeping my fingers crossed for you. You're doing very important advocacy work at PAI, and it's great that you're supporting all these 77 organizations throughout the world that are doing important work in the field of family planning. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much. It was lovely to join you, and thank you for giving us the space. Let's keep up the good fight.
Thanks so much for listening to this conversation. I hope that it left you with a feeling that no matter how challenging the environment where we live can be, it's worth trying to change it for the better. We can all be solutionaries. If you enjoyed this episode, why not listen to the next one? The easiest way is to subscribe to my podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts, or get a monthly newsletter by subscribing to it on my website, veronicaperkova.com. If you have one spare minute, please consider sharing this podcast with your closest friends. I really appreciate your help. I'm Veronika Berkova, and I look forward to talking to you soon.